Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the CP Support webinar series. My name is Debbie Bayless, and today we're going to be talking about the Day 1 Viviana case. So first of all, a big thank you to CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business for their great partnership in ensuring that this valuable information is available to you as you prepare to write CFE in May. This webinar is approximately an hour and 45 minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor for any questions that you will have. However, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, excuse me, please use the Q&A function, and my colleagues will be happy to answer them. So again, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. If, because of time constraints, we are unable to answer your questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your appropriate region or province. I've enclosed their email addresses here for you. Two of the common questions candidates always ask is this webinar recording? Is it recorded? Yes, it is. And it will be available shortly within the next 2 days in D2L under the home page for Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE, or if you're enrolled in Capstone 2, it's also on that home page. Candidates also ask are the slides available? Unfortunately, they are not. However, you do have access to that recording, which means you have the luxury of being able to pause and keep track and make notes of the important information I've shared. So, before we start, I think it's important to share a few good animal jokes that are very applicable as you prepare to write CFE. The first one is all about effective communication. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some best practices to help ensure that your response is clear, concise, and easy to follow. The whole reason the CP support webinars were put together is to help increase your chances of successfully passing CFE. Our hope is that you will not fail. Without a doubt, it is stressful writing CFE. So it's extremely important that you're able to manage your stress well so that you can put your best foot forward. If you haven't had an opportunity yet, please make sure that you watch the stress webinar because there's some really good tips there. And our hope is that when you reach the other side, that you achieve and are awarded your CPA designation. So a very important note, when you are writing your response to the case, it's important that you base your response on the environment that they talk about within that case, even if it's not reflective of what's happening now. So for example, the war on tariffs, that's not going to be part of your case. Only talk about the information that's presented in your case. So our agenda today is we're going to spend kind of equal parts of our time on the Viviana Capstone 1 case. I'm going to go through it and identify all the key information that you need to help ensure that you're able to create an effective and efficient situational analysis. I'm going to talk about that later. What is a situational analysis framework, or situational analysis for short? And I'm going to create a situational analysis and create an outline for a day 1 case. So for those of the candidates who are enrolled in Capstone 2, this would have been the case that you did recently during the module weekend. And certainly last but not least, I'm going to open the floor for questions. Our objectives today are to make sure that you're very familiar with the Capstone 1 case and to also prepare you for writing the day 1 case by sharing with you very valuable best practices. So let's spend some time going through the Capstone 1 case. There are certain components of the Capstone 1 case that we strongly recommend that you memorize. That's the company's vision, mission, values, and key success factors. The reason being is because this will help ensure that you put together an efficient and effective situational analysis. Yes, you will have access to the Capstone 1 case. However, that case is over 50 pages long. You certainly don't want to spend a lot of time shifting through the information to find out what you're looking for. So let's go through the company's vision and mission as it was in the Capstone 1 case. You'll notice I've underlined key phrases. These are key phrases that you need to consider when you're performing a qualitative analysis for the strategic and operational issues. In other words, is implementing that option aligned with components of the company's vision and mission? So let's look at those. The vision is to prepare fresh, authentic, and homemade Italian meals that are served to customers in a traditional, casual, and welcoming setting. The the mission is to offer our customers authentic Italian cuisine in a dining setting that is casual and welcoming. We will provide exceptional food and service, treating customers and employees like family to inspire loyalty. So again, we recommend you memorize these, but be on the lookout in the day 1 case. Have they changed? More likely than not, if they've changed, they've only changed certain phrasing within the existing mission and vision. So what were the 3 values for the Capstone 1 case? Again, I've highlighted the key phrases. So act with integrity, honesty, and respect towards our stakeholders and communities. To continuously find new ways to improve their menus, processes, and customer experience. To prepare food as much as possible from scratch, using fresh and locally sourced food and beverage products. More likely than not, the values won't change significantly when it comes to the day 1 case. However, still be on the lookout. They might change. They might have added another value. When you're creating your situational analysis for day 1, you're always guided by what they provide in the day 1 case. That takes precedence. So let's talk about the key success factors. And it's extremely important to memorize these because they're embedded throughout the Capstone 1 case. You do not want to go trying to find those. You're going to spend an awful lot of non-value added time. What are they? There's 5 of them for the restaurant industry. Access to a multi-skilled and flexible labor force. Proximity to the key market. So there's an easily accessible location that's close to the target market. Efficient control of inventory to control those costs, such as managing their ordering, stocking food, and minimizing food waste. Constantly monitoring and adapting the menu and their portion sizes to control costs and earn reasonable profits, and to achieve a competitive advantage by clearly identifying and defining your market position and that target market. So, a very important consideration is what are the company's objectives and are there constraints? In the Capstone 1 case, there were 4 objectives that they wanted to achieve by 2028. That was to achieve an annual revenue of 50 million, increase the operational profit margin to 7%, diversify revenue to include at least one more revenue stream, and to increase discretionary cash flow to 2 million. Now, I want to really highlight how that was to be calculated. That's important to know. So that's the operating cash flow after taxes of 27%, adding back amortization, and deducting the annual sustainable capital expenditures. From a constraint perspective, there were no bank covenants. However, Nicholas and Viviana wanted to start redeeming their 10,000 preferred shares starting at the end of 2026. So equally over 5 years, which meant that the company needed to pay out 800,000 per year. Now, the objectives in the day one case, maybe some of them may be the same. They may be completely different. So it's important to at least know what they were in the Capstone 1 case, and then again, be on the lookout to see what the new objectives are. When you're considering the objectives, it's important to not only identify them, but when you're analyzing your strategic options, you need to discuss and calculate, if you've got the right information, what the impact would be on those objectives. So I want to clarify what that means. So if you implement an option and it's going to increase revenue, even if it doesn't increase collectively the revenue to 50 million, it is still going to help the company achieve its goal. So from that, it is a viable option. The same premise applies to the operating profit margin. If VTL's current profit margin is 4.2, and if the strategic option is implemented and that profit margin is 6%, they aren't going to achieve their overall 7%, but it is going to help. It's always important to state if implementing that option is going to help them to achieve their objective. So when it comes to your SWOT analysis, I would highly recommend that you wait and extract the relevant case facts from your day one case. However, what I've done here is provided you with some very good ideas of what some of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats were in the Capstone 1 case. You may find that they're still strengths, or they might not be anymore. So let's look at some of the important strengths. Again, you'll notice that I've underlined, and I'm going to explain the equal sign in a moment. So they're known for affordable menu selections and value for money, a good reputation for fresh homemade food. They offer the same products, so they have the same menu across all restaurants. And their online restaurant rating is 4.4 out of 5. That is everything that I've underlined was provided to you in the case. That is a case fact. In other words, that is the what. In order to achieve the required depth, You can't simply restate the case fact. Hence the reason why I've included the equal sign. Now, you'd never do this in your response. However, I want you to show that I'm answering the question, so what? In this instance, what is the potential positive impact to the company? So let's drill down and go through one example. The what, the case fact, is that they have a good reputation for fresh homemade food. So what? Why is it a strength? What is the potential positive impact to the company? The why and the impact is it differentiates their product. So let's look at the weaknesses. And I've highlighted quite a few of these weaknesses. And the reason I've done that is because they have a significant impact on the company's ability. They're going to impede the company's ability for long-term success. So I want you to be on the lookout for these because they might still exist. And they are important considerations when you're analyzing the strategic options from a qualitative perspective. So what are those weaknesses? They source local food and beverages. They only have a single brand, so there's no portfolio brands that offer different types of foods and services. They have limited access to capital and a high total liabilities to total asset ratio. So let's just look at the first point. Again, so what? What's the potential negative impact to the company? The what is they source local food and beverages. The potential negative impact, the why and the impact, is that results in small or no volume discounts. So they aren't able to take advantage of economies of scale, which means higher costs, lower margins. So again, I want to emphasize this, and I will throughout this presentation. Simply stating case facts is not enough. Even if you think the why and impact is obvious, nobody can give you credit for what's not on the page. And I want you to know this is one of the top 3 reasons why candidates fail CFE. So what are the opportunities in the Capstone 1 case? And again, when you are looking at the opportunities for the day 1 case, make sure you're looking for opportunities that are aligned and that, you know what, that apply to the situational options you're entertaining, you need to analyze. So in this instance, I've pulled the opportunities that are appropriate based on the strategic options for the Capstone 1 case. Things like successful companies were adapting product mix and menu, the healthy choices. They were commercializing specialty products and selling it through different retail outlets. They were having different types of restaurants operate under different brand names, but within the same corporate entity. There was a wider selection of products and menu items that could be offered through the ghost kitchens. Again, make sure you include the why and the impact. So let's look at the threats. You'll notice I have some of these factors highlighted. Be on the lookout. Do they exist in the day 1 case? These threats are significant and they could impede VTL's ability for its long-term success. Things like intense competition, saturated market. The demand for Italian food is declining, and some companies are considering consolidating. That's the only way that they can gain market share and achieve those economies of scale so that they are able to have better and stronger operating profit margins. So again, be on the lookout because this also directs which strategic options are going to mitigate these. So that is a very strong pro for a situational initiative. Let's spend a moment and just reflect on VTL's overall financial performance when it comes to Capstone 1. Revenue, well, their revenue growth in 2024 was only 0.88% compared to the industry growth of 3.4%. So you've done a calculation, you've stated the result. It's important to not only state the result, but provide insights to the board. Why is their revenue growth lower than industry? It's because of, based on the case facts, poorly performing restaurants and the threat that the demand for Italian food is declining. So if all things are equal, what's the implication? That's important to highlight to the board. So revenue will continue to decline if the demand for Italian food continues to decline. Let's look at some of their costs as percentage of revenue. The food and beverage costs are higher than industry. Why? Part of that is very much tied to their current strategy because it's important for them to have fresh, homemade food. Therefore, they purchase their food and beverages locally, which means they can't take advantage of the economies of scale. Their net operating profit is lower. Why? Again, it's partly because they want to ensure from pricing perspective it's fair, it's consistent, and affordable. That is impacting their profit margin and the fact that their costs are higher. So what's the implication? If things stay the same, operating profit margin is going to continue to shrink. What about from a cash flow perspective? Well, the operating cash flow for 2024 was a little over 2.7 million. Again, if all things are equal, how would that look in 2025 if they achieve the same operating cash flow? Well, based on their cash commitments, they will not earn enough to cover those costs. Those costs include the preferred share dividends, the preferred share redemption, the sustainable capital investments, and they're also looking at, Marco in particular, wants common share dividends. So when we sit back and look at the big picture when it comes to VTL's overall financial situation, the overall conclusion is status quo is not sustainable. VTL must consider strategies that'll increase revenue and keep those costs manageable. So again, when you're looking at the company's overall financial health, it's important to identify areas of concern. When you're looking at the strategic options, you need to consider how will they affect those areas of concern? Will they impact it in a positive way? When it comes to the stakeholders and their objectives, all you really need to know is who were the key players in the Capstone 1 case. For their objectives, be guided by what their objectives are in the day 1 case. So I'm quickly going to go through the board of director members. So Nicholas is the chair, and he and Viviana, his wife, started the business. It's also important to note that 3 out of the 4 board members are family. His preference is to make sure that their food is authentic and it's served in a traditional setting and atmosphere. His focus is making sure that VTL generates that sufficient operating cash. Why? Because he wants to make sure that the company is able to afford and repurchase those preferred shares. So for the day one case, be on the lookout. Did they start redeeming their shares? Sophia is the CEO and the board director. She believes that changes need to be made because there's changes in the customer's taste and preference, and there's new competitors. She is also wanting to make sure that the company has sufficient cash flow to pay dividends and to pay and redeem those preferred shares. Bianca, now she is the only non-family member. She is a chef of the very successful Vancouver restaurant, and she, of course, is a board director. She would like to see that chefs have more freedom to create unique dishes that are going to appeal to the local customers that they serve. And she would like to see VTL embrace more sustainable practices. The last board member is Marco. He's a board director, but he doesn't work for the organization on a day-to-day basis. His main focus is he wants to make sure that VTL can generate sufficient cash flow so that they can start paying dividends on common shares. So what were the strategic options? I'm going to go through what the options are. That's all you really need to know is what were the options. Because what happens in the day one case is they'll tell you what strategic option or options they implemented. They'll give you a little summary of what happened and the success to date. So you don't need to spend an awful lot of time reviewing the response, going through the very extensive quantitative analysis, because all you really need to know is what were the options, and then you're going to base all of your information on the day one case. So the options were close the poorly performed restaurants. There were 4 of them, and also allowed the chefs to adapt the menu. So they would be allowed to adapt up to 3 unique, healthy, and creative menu items that would appeal to the local market. Another option was to acquire a Nakato Bowl, and that's a chain of Asian, quick service Asian restaurants with limited in-house seating. And how that would be financed is VTL would purchase 100% of their shares by exchanging some of their common shares in VTL. Also, for VTL locations, the poorly performing restaurants would be converted into quick service restaurants. Another option was to manufacture and distribute Viviana's vegetable pasta sauce. And the final strategic option was to open ghost kitchens with tastes of the world. And within that, there were 2 options. The first one was that VTL rented the fully equipped kitchen, but they staffed it themselves and they prepared the orders. The second option was that the food was prepared in a multi-brand kitchen that was owned and operated by TOWL. And they would use their award-winning technology, so that was their online website, and the food would be delivered by a third-party provider. Financing. Again, all you need to know is what the options are and then be on the lookout day one to see what they implemented. If they chose to manufacture the pasta sauce and distribute it, then they had the option of borrowing $3.5 million from Hanover Food Processing for the equipment. If not, the only other financing option that they had was a line of credit from Radisson Bank, which would have been secured against accounts receivable. So the loan was up to 75% of accounts receivable to a maximum of $1.5 million. Ethical operational issues. So let's just summarize these. Day one case, be on the lookout. Do these still exist? Did they handle them? They'll give you a summary of what they did. There was an ethical issue. Pierre, a restaurant manager, giving away free liquor and meals to his friends and family in exchange for them to weekly rate his restaurant 5 stars. There was an issue with liquor inventory control. There's a governance issue. And that's where two shareholders, so Nicholas and Marco, they don't work. They're not part of the day-to-day operations. And they're very focused on making sure that VTL had the appropriate cash flow available to redeem those shares and make sure that common dividends were provided. So the question is whether their decisions are in and whether they're acting in the best interests of the organization. They also looked at automating bread making using breadobotics, and that would have improved the margins and profits. Looked at implementing a formal tip sharing policy, and there was a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, particular around underrepresentation in the workforce at the management level. So I want to take some time and talk about overarching and significant issues. These are factors that impact the company in a significant way. It impacts the company in many of the decisions it makes. It impacts the strategic options that they look at, which are most appropriate, also from an operational perspective, and they impact your overall recommendations. So let's go through some very clear examples. Here's a laundry list of examples that we've seen in the past. Be on the lookout for them. So poor communication. The board, there's conflicting objectives, potentially conflict of interest. Governance structure, maybe only one shareholder, has the voting control. There's lack of long-range planning, could be supply and or production constraints, limited cash to invest in strategic options, or based on the case facts, there's going to be limited cash. Maybe be on the lookout. Is there repayment of debt? Is there repurchase of shares? The lack of focus on the core business, lack of innovation, a company's inability to reduce costs, the company's competitive advantage is eroding. Maybe they're looking at implementing options under an unrealistic timeline. If there's a downturn of the economy, that's going to impact any of the decisions the company makes. Whether there's a going concern issue, if there's significant financing constraints, potential fraud, limited management resources. So let me provide you with a specific example. Not all these overarching significant issues are clearly identified or that you're clearly told to discuss them. For example, a case might say, one of the managers might say, you know what, we're very overtaxed. And then later on in the case, it might say, provide you with some examples of errors that have happened or areas in the operation that they've kind of fallen short on, that they're not able to keep track of because they're too busy. That's an important trigger that you need to carefully consider that significant issue. So limited management resources is something you would need to consider when you perform your qualitative analysis for any of your strategic options. Think about, if you implement that option, is it going to free up management's time? If it is, that is a very important advantage. Is it going to use more of management time? That's a very important disadvantage for that. When you provide your overall recommendations, so let's just say your 4 strategic options, potentially 5 sometimes in a case, they're all viable, and you provide a recommendation that they should implement all 4 or 5. However, a significant issue is that they have limited management time. That needs to be addressed. If you don't address that, the overall recommendations you provided, they're not credible. They're not realistic. It's not possible. And that could result in you failing day one. So what were the overarching and significant issues when it came to VTL for the Capstone 1 case? The cash flow, we talked about that. So it's very important to look at initiatives that are going to help improve cash flow. The demand for Italian food is declining and the market is saturated. Also, the negative impact that VTL's current strategy is having on their profits. So as I said, you need to identify those issues. They may be there, they may not be. If they are there, it's important to discuss them. They need to be part of your analysis of each of the strategic options, and they need to be carefully considered when you provide your overall recommendations. So let's take a moment to just talk about day one. So as you know, day one is a 4-hour exam. It's that comprehensive case, which is linked to Capstone 1. We've already talked about the Capstone 1 case. So it's Viviana, a few years later. They'll tell you what they implemented, and now they're looking to you for more advice. They're looking for you to analyze some strategic and operational initiatives and provide them with sound recommendations. The focus is on enabling competencies, so your ability to problem solve. Your assessment is separate. So day one, you would receive a pass or fail assessment. And when it comes to your technical competencies, you're assessed at the core level. So I mentioned situational analysis or situational analysis framework a few times. This is a very important component of your response, and it is a requirement for day one. And the reason it's a requirement is because what you're being tested on is to demonstrate that you have a clear understanding of the internal and external environment in which the company operates and the objectives they want to achieve. So in order to demonstrate that, you first need to identify those key factors in your situational analysis. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of integrating that into your analysis of the strategic and operational initiatives. So this checklist, the framework is a checklist. Is implementing this option aligned with the company's vision, mission, and values? Does it capitalize on the key success factors, the company's strengths, and the opportunities in the industry? Does it mitigate the company's weaknesses and reduce those threats? Does it help the company achieve its targets and objectives? Does it help improve the company's financial areas of concern? And if there is a covenant, does it ensure that that covenant is met? What are the components? These components are all the information I've already talked about when it comes to Capstone 1 case. Now we're going to look at it in the context of the day one case. So mission, vision, values, key success factors. As I said, memorize them. The targets and objectives going to be based on the day one case. What are the constraints? Are there covenants now? Is there maybe a production or a supply constraint? Again, for the SWOT analysis, you're going to extract the relevant case facts from the day one case. And don't forget the why and the impact. The great news is, say that you have one of the opportunities is that there is a target market that's growing, and you have two strategic options that could capitalize on that opportunity. Even though it's one factor from your situational analysis, it will be counted twice when it comes to integration. And I'll explain that a little bit further as we go along. For your quantitative analysis, so this is also part of your situational analysis, it's just a high-level analysis to gain an understanding of the company's overall financial health and to identify those potential areas of concern. So what are some items to consider? Well, if there's financial objectives that they want to achieve, how is the company doing now? Revenue, if there's more than one source of revenue, what's driving those numbers from a positive and a negative perspective? So maybe there's 2 or 3 divisions. Who's contributing to revenue growth? The same principle applies for profit margins. So which divisions are impacting profitability from a positive and a negative perspective? I always say be on the lookout for cash, because if there's limited cash available, that means financing is required. And sometimes there's limited access to financing. What's the implication if there's limited cash and limited availability to financing? That means that that limits the number and the types of strategic and operational issues that can be implemented. Make sure that you just provide a 1 or 2 line information and overall conclusion regarding the company's health. You can draw a lot of valuable information when you perform this very high-level quantitative analysis. For example, if they're only offering one revenue stream and Italian food is on the decline, then in order to grow revenue, they need to diversify and look at other sources of revenue. There are lots of opportunities when it comes to your quantitative analysis. So depending, sometimes they'll give you more information. There's more opportunities to perform calculations, and sometimes it's limited. Consider their covenants. Are they compliant? Be on the lookout. Are there significant, improvements or the opposite? Are there significant areas that are getting worse? If they provide you with industry benchmarks, make sure that you compare VTL's performance to the industry benchmarks. If they provide you more than 1 year, make sure that you calculate it for the years that they provided. And talk about the trend. Is it improving? Is it getting worse? Or is it stable? Always make sure that you identify the areas of concern, because when you go to analyze those strategic options, you're going to also be able to, and know that you should, discuss the impact implementing that option would have on these areas of concern. So when you write your situational analysis, there's really 2 parts to it. It's not simply creating a standalone situational analysis and that's it. Because remember, you're being tested on Yes, I understand the internal and external environment in which you operate and what you want to achieve. So that means you need to take those factors from the situational analysis and include them, the appropriate factors, into your qualitative and quantitative analysis of those various requirements. So the only way it counts towards integration is it must be in your situational analysis, and you must include it in your analysis of those requirements for it to be counted. And when I go through the outline, I'm going to show you how there's lots of opportunities to integrate key information from your situational analysis. When it comes to your qualitative analysis, you want to look at key components from your SWOT analysis and your key success factors. And these are your primary considerations, okay? In other words, make sure if there's an opportunity and implementing that option capitalizes on that opportunity, that's an important advantage. Your secondary area is to talk about whether implementing that option is aligned or misaligned with some of the phrasing for the company's mission, vision, and values. And the reason I say it's secondary is because it's very unusual that they will provide you with a strategic or operational issue that is completely against a company's mission, vision, or values. If it is, that's a very important con and a very important reason why not to do it. But the reason I say it's secondary is because unless it's a differentiator. So if all of them strategic options are, at least partially aligned, that means that none of them that, alignment or misalignment or partly alignment with the mission, vision, values is really not a differentiator. So that's why I say concentrate on your SWOT first and then your key success factors. And then finally, your alignment with mission, vision, and values. When it comes to your quantitative analysis, you want to make sure that you always discuss the impact to the objectives. Is it going to help the company achieve its goals? And what are the impact to the constraint or constraints? So I want to talk about outlining for a moment before I go in and share the best practice. Why use an outline? I'm hoping at this point that you have perfected creating an outline. If you haven't, it is critical. Creating an outline allows you to extract those relevant case facts. So make sure that you're extracting what you need. And then when you turn that into your response, you're able to highlight the key case facts. It helps you manage your time. And it's a roadmap for your response. Plus, it allows you to see the big picture. Now, when it comes to the options available and how you create an outline, many candidates will create it electronically in Word. Some will handwrite it. There's no right or wrong answer. And in some capacities, sometimes candidates use a combination of both. It is a personal choice and style, and part of it really depends on your own learning style. There are pros and cons to both. However, the best practice I'm going to be sharing with you is to create an outline, an electronic outline in Word. This is a best practice that I have learned from candidates over several years that have successfully passed CFE the first time. I want you to carefully consider If you're spending all your time highlighting information and writing in the margins, and an hour and 15 minutes in, and you have nothing on the page, and you're finding you're having to spend lots of time to transpose that information on the paper onto their page, why not alleviate that first step? Okay. So for the next part of this webinar, I'm going to go through and create a situational analysis framework and create an outline for the day one case. So this is the sample day one case that was covered in Capstone 2 module workshop. And I'm also going to look at and create the outline part for just the first assessment opportunity, which is sauce production expansion. So bear with me for a moment, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the slides I've created, one half, and on the other half, you are going to see the module workshop case. So first of all, let's make our lives easier and save time, since time management is critical. So let's create the structure for a response. So we can turn that outline and situational analysis right into a response. So we know we need to include to, from, and regarding. So let's put it in. We know that we need to include a situational analysis. That's the first part of our response. So we know what the categories are: the vision, mission, values, key success factors, the objectives, put in constraints, and that you'll only need it if it's applicable. You know you need to perform a high-level quantitative analysis, and of course, a SWOT analysis. So now I already have at least my structure set up. You'll notice when it comes to values and key success factors, this would not be included in your situation analysis, but I'm highlighting it just to emphasize the point. Why write all the values out and all the key success factors if you're not going to use them? Why waste the time? So when you're analyzing and you're going through the case, and you're looking at the different strategic options, and you think, oh, that capitalizes on the value of, you're going to include that in your qualitative analysis, and then you're going to go back to your situation analysis and add that value. Again, that's a good time saver. So now let's start with, and I'm going to follow CPA's planning steps. So the first step is to allocate time to planning. And their recommendation is to allocate 60 minutes plus another 15 minutes. So I've put it all together and put it under the category of ROP. ROP means reading the case, creating your situational analysis, and creating your outline. P stands for planning. So determining the order of your requireds and allocating the time. So if you noticed, I've put and recorded that I'm going to start at 9 and I'll finish that part of my planning process at 10:15. The remaining time, so from 10:15 to 1, I'm going to prepare my response. Later on, I'm going to take that writing time and I'm going to divide it into smaller chunks based on the requireds. The second step is to read the narrative. So let's start to look at the case. In the first 2 paragraphs, it provides me with some valuable information: the date, my role, and what has happened. Now you are going to notice I have highlighted here the key information that I'm extracting. I've also put on the case what category this would fall under. I've done this for illustration purposes only. If I'm writing this and creating this situational analysis and outline, I'm not taking and highlighting everything and writing things in the margins. If it's important enough, why not extract it now? Because that allows me to turn these relevant case facts into a response quickly. So again, the highlighting and the comments are just for illustration purposes only. So I've included the timeline and the role. What's happened? It's up to you whether you want to include that because you're not going to need it as part of your response. I've only included it because I want to make sure that I have a clear understanding of what happened. And hopefully you practice so many cases that you want to make sure again that you know what happened. So what happened in this case? They retained all locations. The Italian dishes and ingredients remained the same. However, they allowed the chefs to add a customized menu that needed to be approved quarterly. They did implement the breadobotics in the busiest restaurants, and they manufactured and distributed pasta sauce. There's also a strength that's been identified. So let's extract that and include it under the strengths in my situational analysis. So breadobotics machine, it's increased the efficiencies and reduced the labor costs at the busiest restaurant locations. Here I am. I want to make sure that when I go back to complete my response, I include the Y in impact. So I'm including that equal sign. It's a trigger for me. Make sure, Debbie, you include the Y and the impact. Okay, so let's scroll down here. Goodness, sorry, giving me a little bit of a hard time. So let's scroll down here and look at the next paragraph. There's some great information from a quantitative perspective. So let's extract that and include it in the quantitative analysis. So they've given us what the net operating profit margin was and what the revenue was. Hey, I can calculate operating profit margin quite easily. I'm also going to put a friendly reminder for me. What's the implication? I need to answer that question. So what? That's the result. How would that and could that impact VTL's future success? Talks about that the two best performing restaurants, that they actually totaled 6.1 million each in revenue. So again, I just quickly calculated, and that represents 20% of VTL's total revenue. So again, what is the implication? I'll come back to it. They also provide us with some forecasted annual sales and what the forecasted operating margin is for the pasta sauce. Great. I can calculate operating profit. So look, the operating profit is much higher for the pasta sauce than it is for the company as a whole. However, it still only represents less than 10% of the company's overall revenue. So again, I'm going to talk about that implications, and I'm going to include just a category about drawing some overall conclusions. There's also a strength that I want to extract, and that the sales for the pasta sauce has been very successful, and as a result, the supplier has extended the contract. Equal sign to remind me, Debbie, go back and include my Y in impact. So what about the next paragraph? In this paragraph, it provides a little bit of an overview again of what's happened. There's a weakness there that I want to extract, and it provides us with the objectives. So let's extract that information and include it in our situational analysis. What happened? Sophie's now the board chair. They did start to, those Preferred dividends are now up to date. They did start to redeem the preferred shares. A weakness is Nicholas had to step down from the board due to a health issue. Here's important information. What are their objectives? They want to improve the overall operating profit margin. So even if you didn't think to calculate operating profit margin, that's the trigger you need to calculate the company's current operating profit margin. How do you know if it's going to improve it if you don't know what the current margin is? They want to prioritize the strategies with the highest positive cash flow. Reason being is because they want to accelerate that redemption of Nicholas and Viviana's shares, and they also want to pay common shareholders $40,000 a year. So here's our clear objectives. Now let's look at the next few paragraphs. And in there, they identify a constraint, a threat, and that threat also has an impact to my quantitative analysis. So let's look at that. The constraint is they have 500,000 cash from operations. So we're always going to recommend use that cash first. Then they have the ability to borrow up to 6 million. So they have a total of 6.5 million available maximum. So you want to make sure that your recommendations doesn't exceed the available capital. The only reason I've included the terms is I don't know what the requirements are yet, and maybe they're going to ask me to perform a cash flow analysis. Here's some threats. Let's extract that information. So the restaurant industry growth, it's stagnating. Why? Due to increase in interest rates and Canadians are eating at home more often. And there's increased food prices and increase in labor costs. Remember, go back for the why and the impact. We know already that we've calculated the operating profit margin for the company, but now we've got additional information to give us context. So the industry benchmark is 4%. So Viviana is still lower. And we know that food prices and labor costs are going to increase. So I'm going to go back and talk about how that's going to have a negative impact on the company's operating margin. So what about the next paragraph? It provides us with some great opportunities. So again, let's put that into our situational analysis. So the popularity of ready-to-heat meals and at-home meal kits. The restaurant or food brands associated with well-known persons, they're gaining popularity and they're finding that there's other revenue sources. What about the next section? The mission and vision has been revised. So I want to make sure that I include that information. So let's include the up-to-date, the revised vision. Again, remember, if something changes in the day one case, that's the information that you're going to include in your situational analysis. There's no mention of values, so maybe they're unchanged, but I'm going to wait. I'm going to make sure in the narrative that there isn't any more information. But anyway, I'm only going to add the values when I look at the different strategic options that are available. So let's look at the last paragraph. And some of this wording is common. So they want you to analyze and make recommendations for each proposal presented. So the wording is similar. They also say, though, the board would also like you to comment on VTL's overall strategic direction and how each proposal might affect that direction. I need to add that because that is a requirement. I'm going to add, so every requirement, I use that as a heading. And underneath that, I'm going to put word for word what they want me to do so that I make sure in my response, I address what they've asked me to do. Fundamental principle is if they ask you to do something, make sure that you do. This is just a friendly reminder. Be on the lookout for any of those significant or overarching issues. They might not be clearly defined. They might not ask you to talk about them. But if they have, if there's significant weakness or threat, it's important that you carefully consider those when you're analyzing your strategic and operational issues and providing the board with your overall recommendations. So now let's go further onto the case. And if you notice, there's an outline of what the appendices are. So in this instance, there's more narrative under the board meeting. And then there are 4 exhibits. And based on this information, I can already deduce that here are my strategic options: sauce production expansion, ready to heat meals, flagship location leased, and acquisition of Whole Bread Inc. So this involves, it's different because of the order in which this information is presented. You're just going to look at what the appendices are about. That will give you a better sense of what the strategic options are. They're pretty straightforward and explanatory. So again, let's set us up for success. Let's set up the structure that we need when it comes for our response and our analysis of the strategic options. So when we look at that, always use the heading for the required, okay? So the sauce production expansion. We know that we always need to perform both a quantitative and qualitative analysis. So include those. When it comes to your quantitative analysis, please include these other subtitles: assumptions and impact to objectives. And in this instance, there's a constraint. So include those items. That makes sure that you address them in your response. From a qualitative perspective, make sure that you include the subtitles, whether it's pros, cons, advantages, disadvantages, risks, or opportunities. Make sure that you look at both sides. Don't forget that why and impact. And of course, you need to include a recommendation. The great thing about creating an outline in Word is you can copy this structure several times. So very quickly, you can copy that structure for ready to heat meals, for the flagship location, and for acquiring whole breads. So now let's scroll down and let's start going through the transcript of the board meeting. And if you notice in the first section, there are some strengths and weaknesses. And there's also a comment from Sophia that we need to consider and discuss when it comes to the company's overall strategy. So let's extract that information. So here are the strengths. Every restaurant had a positive operating profit in 2026. The head chef turnover is the lowest in years. However, from a weakness perspective, the lack of kitchen staff has increased the stress for the chefs, and VTL is uncertain if they can increase kitchen wages. Also, Sophia made and brought forth a very important point we need to discuss when it comes to VTL's overall strategy. The question is, should they capitalize on the opportunities to improve restaurant margins because restaurants are their core business? So let's continue to scroll down. Here's another two strengths that we've identified. We know one of the strategic options is about sauce production expansion, and here's a qualitative factor to consider in our analysis of that option. So again, let's put that information in. And I want to start showing you examples of integration. One of the things we've already included as a strength is that they have had good success to date when it comes to the sauce production. So you'll notice I've said good success to date, bracket, strength. So I am clearly communicating that that is a current strength. That is a good example of integration. It also says in the case that the quality product is due to high quality manufacturing. That is also a strength. Now, it's not in my situational analysis right now. So what am I going to do? I'm going to include it under the pros, and I'm also going to include it in my situational analysis. I'm going to include that equal sign because I've got to make sure I go back for the y and the impact. Now I have two examples of integration. So let's keep going through. Here are a few more qualitative factors when it comes to expanding production. So let's input that information into our outline. So one of the things is, and the reason why it's important to make sure you make note of the current timeline is that this option, so expanding, it needs to be implemented in less than 10 months. That is an important consideration from a disadvantage perspective. There's also a concern about the negative impact to freshness. And that is a key component of VTL's branding, which is a strength. So again, what am I going to do? I'm going to make sure that I include that strength also in my situational analysis. Now I'm on my third example of integration. So let's look at the next paragraph. It provides me with an assumption and another qualitative factor. So let's include that. So when it comes to the assumptions, one of them is that they've used the average weekly sauce figures for the restaurant. Now, you don't simply just list the assumptions. You need to, based on the case facts, talk about what the potential impact is to your quantitative results. So if they're using the average, and in fact that number is too low, then that is going to have a negative impact on your quantitative analysis. A con is that the amount of sauce needed for each of the restaurants is not predictable week to week. Again, come back for that why and impact. So now as I go through, I'm not going to, because of we only have so much time, I'm not going to go through each of the other strategic options. But again, the principle is the same. If it's important, extract it, include it in your outline and your situational analysis if applicable. So let's keep scrolling down. And as we get here closer to the end of the case, there is another required. And this is Nicholas has asked the board of directors that said, you know what, Viviana has a chance to be a guest on a popular cooking show. So this is another thing that we need to address. So again, what are we going to do? Oh, sorry, I went a little bit too quick there. So there are also some other pros that I've extracted from the case. quality. So they talked about quality, and they were concerned about at least this option would ensure it was standardized. Again, another integrated opportunity. That the labor costs were going to be lower than VTLs, and there's no issues with availability, which is a threat. So here we're showing other great examples of integration. There's 5 examples of integration. There's also other options and opportunities for integration, whether it is alignment with a value. We talked about the weakness of the chefs kind of experiencing more stress. So centralizing this function is going to free up their time. The alignment with some of the phrasing in the vision and values are, is it really preparing fresh, authentic, homemade Italian? Treating customers and employees like family. If they centralize that function, there could be loss of jobs or less hours. And then again, is it questionable if they're preparing food as much as possible from scratch? So I wanted to show you that there are several integration opportunities. Again, to achieve a yes in this section, you don't need all of those, but I'm showing you that there are numerous opportunities to integrate key information from your situational analysis. If you add values, remember I said, for it to count as integration, you need to go back to your situational analysis and add those. So now let's look at that other requirement. So let's use the title, Promote VTL on a Popular Cooking Show. They provide you with some qualitative factors. So let's include those. They also say Nicholas is wanting not only for the board to provide a recommendation of whether she should appear on this popular cooking show, but also should provide some advice. State what she should promote, whether she should promote the restaurants or potentially any of the options implemented. So again, I want to make sure that I address that. If you notice here, also, Sophia asked a very important question when it comes to the company's overall strategy. Let's add that under the section of the quantitative analysis, under the section 4, I'll move forward and I'll go back again, for the company's overall strategic direction. So the board is unclear regarding the appropriate strategy moving forward. Again, I'm just going to put, to show integration, a current weakness. I'm doing that to clearly demonstrate to the marker, I am aware that this is a weakness. I'm going to make sure that I include that weakness in my situational analysis. So her question is, should they pursue different revenue streams or focus on the restaurant's operations? So let me just go back again. And this is not from the case, but these are great examples of integration when it comes to your qualitative analysis for the popular cooking show. Okay, it's based on they could take advantage of promoting pasta sauce, okay? They could take advantage of capitalizing on that trend that people are preparing food at home, or the opportunity to kind of capitalize on that restaurants or food brands associated with well-known people are gaining popularity. If they implement the ready-to-heat meals, they can profile that. If they decide for the flagship location, they can promote that. So these are all particular qualitative and advantages based on other information within the case. A potential con is that because it's across the country, it may not be targeted to their specific target market, which is a key success factor. So we've talked about the overall strategy. Make sure that when you notice that there's a weakness and you haven't included it in your situational analysis, don't only include it in your qualitative analysis, make sure that you include it in your situational analysis. Then you are awarded a value and you've demonstrated integration. When it comes to the overall strategy, there's lots of opportunity to integrate information from your quantitative analysis. You need to talk about the restaurant business. We know that their profit margin is lower than industry. We know that it represents over 90% of the company's total revenue. We also know that the costs are increasing. And the threat is that people are eating at home. So in order to increase profit margins, they need to focus on initiatives that are going to reduce costs. When it comes to pasta sauce, we already know some information that we can extract and include from our quantitative analysis, that it has a much stronger operating profit margin, but it only represents less than 10%. However, there is an opportunity to improve profit margin. How? By centralizing not only the sauce production, but potentially looking at centralizing other vegetable sauce. So again, implementing this option would actually complement the restaurant business. Make sure that you also need to provide a clear recommendation of whether the company should focus on the restaurants, or maybe they should focus on the restaurants and strategic and operational initiatives that complement the restaurant. So I want to just take a moment to look at just one appendices and kind of talk about the types of information you're going to extract. So let's look at the sauce production expansion. There is both quantitative information and qualitative information. What I would do is, as you're reviewing this appendices, is organize your case facts appropriately. When it comes to your quantitative analysis, I would include the page number. And as you're reading, this is the section that I would highlight. I would highlight the quantitative information. And then I go back to it when I'm performing my quantitative analysis. But as I'm reading, I'm going to determine what type of quantitative tools I need to do. Based on the information provided, I know that I need to calculate and compare the current cost to produce at each of the restaurants opposed to centralizing it. And what's the difference between the two? We know the objectives, so we need to look at the operating margin. We know we need to also look at the cash flow. That's the objectives. I've included an important note here. Be on the lookout for quantitative information in the narrative, okay? So in your narrative, not in your appendices, but in your narrative, the discussion of the board meeting, they might have important quantitative information. It's going to get lost. So make sure that you include that information under the appropriate sections for your quantitative. Here's another assumption. They talked about that they're using the average cost. Well, we know based on case facts that some of these costs are going to increase. So you not only need to identify the assumption, but you need to relate relevant case facts and talk about what that impact would be. So please don't state if the costs are different, the quantitative results would be different. That's obvious. Based on the case facts, you want to share that those costs are increasing. So therefore, if those costs are higher, that would have a negative impact on the company's operating profit margin and cash flow. And also in your exhibits, there's a few cons that I'm going to extract. So now I'm going to step back and take a moment and kind of reflect on what I need to do. The other step is planning. Well, one of the great things about creating your electronic outline is as you're reading, you're creating that structure. You're already starting to plan. You want to make sure, are there any significant issues? You want to consider what are the appropriate quantitative tools. And again, we've kind of done that as we've created the outline. When it comes to ordering your requireds, you need to consider, is your analysis of one of the strategic options and your recommendation going to impact another? So let me give you an example. If there is a supply constraint and one of the strategic options is to increase supply, well, you need to analyze that first and determine what additional supply is available, because most likely the other strategic options are going to need that added supply. And then, of course, you need to allocate your time. So the order that the requireds were given to you in the case was, the first thing was about VTL's overall strategy, then the strategic options, and then the cooking show opportunity. Well, you need to reorder that. Priority, you need to spend the appropriate time when it comes to the strategic options. If you address those options that are non-strategic first, you could end up paying, most likely you'll end up spending too much time, and that's going to negatively impact your ability to complete your response for the others. So that means let's look at the strategic options first. There's no integration, so we'll address them in the order that they were given, then the cooking show opportunity, and then VTL's overall strategy. So when you're looking at your time allocation, a best practice is to, again, write down the time for each of those required and write it down on one of the lined pieces of paper that you have in your rough booklet, because that way you can have it off to the side so you can carefully and make sure that you're always watching your time. You want to base your time on the amount of information you already have in your outline. So if you notice beside each of the strategic options, I have QQC. That's quantitative, qualitative, and conclusion. So I've allocated 30 minutes each. But guess what? You might already have lots of information done. The quantitative analysis is not that much to do for one of the options. Then maybe you only allocate 20 minutes or 25 minutes instead, and you need more time somewhere else. Judge it based on the information that you have and what you need to do. When it comes to the cooking show, you need to only look at a quantitative and provide a conclusion. For VTL overall strategy and your overall recommendations, I've allocated 10 minutes. And then I've allocated some time to review so that you have the ability to go back and make sure that you've addressed all of the things that you've been asked to do. So watch that time carefully, stick by it, and know that you need to move on, because it's extremely important that you address all those requireds within the time you have. Your overall recommendation, lots of times when I say you have 5 minutes left, I notice candidates are frantically typing and they're just completing their overall recommendations. This is an important component. If it's not done well, it could be the reason you don't pass. You need to make sure that you address these requirements. Prioritize what order in which they should be completed. If there's a significant issue, address that first. Discuss the interrelationships between the requireds. And if there is a constraint, there's only so much capital available, make sure that your recommendations don't exceed that amount. Because if not, if they do, your recommendations are not credible, and that could absolutely result in a fail. So here's a structure that kind of provides really good context and addresses all the requirements. So again, tell the board of directors. So based on what your objectives and your constraints are, I recommend the following in the order of priority. If it's an overarching issue, like limited management time, you need to address that first. Provide a recommendation so that the board, that increases the chances of the board able to efficiently implement your strategic and operational recommendations. State in the order of preference what your option is. Provide not only the quantitative reason, but the strongest qualitative reasons why. The reason why for priority is highest, who has the highest impact to cash flow, the strongest impact to operational margin. And then talk about the interrelationships. So some of the potential interrelationships in this aspect is, well, if you recommend expanding the sauce production, the facility can only be used in one capacity, so you are unable to pursue the ready-to-make meals. If you recommend the flagship location, that means that you could possibly open a whole breads retail location in that retail space. And again, when it comes to promoting that cooking show, there is an opportunity to be able to promote the restaurants, sauces, and almost all of the opportunities if you recommend to implement them, except for whole brands, because that would be brand confusion. So at this point, what I want to do is again share with you. So I know that I showed you an awful lot of slides. But here is what this looks like. So sorry, let me bring it to the top here. So here is what your situational analysis and your outline looks like. You notice I'll have things that are crossed off because that's not relevant to your response. But look at the structure. You have more than enough information to write your response from a qualitative perspective in particular. So I wanted you to see what that actually looks like. So now let's talk about, we've done the example, let's look at the feedback guide for that sample day one case. What were they looking for? When it comes to integration from your situational analysis, the expectation is that you integrate 3 factors when you're analyzing the various strategic options. I showed you an example where there were at least 5, if not anywhere up to 10. When it comes to the cooking show and VTL's overall strategy, you need to integrate 2 factors. And when it comes to your quantitative analysis for your situational analysis, you need to either perform 3 ratios or talk about 3 components of the financial statements. We had that nailed when we created our outline. Again, remember what the purpose is. Why are you creating a situational analysis? Why is it that you need to integrate these factors? Because you're demonstrating your understanding of how the internal and external environment affects the decisions the company makes. Plus, it will ensure that your recommendations are credible and convincing. Board of Examiners say that weak candidates, when it comes to their SWOT, they just list those case facts. No why, no impact. Remember, include the why and the impact when you're talking about key success factors, SWOT, your qualitative analysis. And when they talk about Alignment, they don't provide specifics of how, and I'm going to share that with you shortly. When it comes to your quantitative and qualitative analysis of that sauce production expansion, what did you need to do to achieve a yes? You needed to perform a reasonable quantitative analysis. So achieve yes on 2 out of the 4 possibilities. So calculating the cost to produce in-house, to produce at the production facility, the difference, and also to discuss other financial implications or quantitative considerations. Ha! You will always get a yes if you include and address those subheadings, assumptions, and impact to objectives and constraints. For the qualitative, you needed to identify 6 pros and cons and have a balanced approach. That does not mean that you need 3 pros and 3 cons. What that means is you need to address both of them. What are the advantages and disadvantages? But simply stating case facts is not enough. You need to explain that why and the impact. When it comes to your calculations, it needs to be supported. So in other words, if you include a 10% revenue, growth factor in your analysis, you need to include that in notes. The marker is not expected to look at your formula to determine how you came to your input amounts. What did we candidates do? They spent way too much time on the quantitative analysis and made it overly complicated. And they didn't integrate, they didn't talk about the impact to the company's objectives and the constraints. When it came to qualitative, again, sometimes some of them only just talked about the advantages or the disadvantages. And they missed that why. So let's provide specific examples of how to address the how when it comes to vision. So VTL's vision is to treat employees like family. So we're talking about the pasta sauce expansion. So removing this function and automating it, that could be seen as not treating employees by family, as family, because it could result in loss of jobs or loss of hours. So this, therefore, implementing this option contradicts this portion of the company's vision. So that explains the how. When it comes to a key success factor, you need to state the factor, you need to explain the how, plus you also need to explain the so what. What's the potential positive impact? So effectively controlling inventory and managing food waste is a key success factor. So if they are unable to predict their sauce needs, they could order too much. And this would negatively impact the company's profit margin. So again, I've shown you examples of how to address the how, and when it comes to the key success factors, to also address the why, the impact. So how do we do that when you're doing the quantitative analysis? So again, I've told you it's important to include what those objectives are. And then you're going to integrate relevant case facts to support whether implementing that option is going to help. So when it came to the sauces, that was going to increase. Okay, so the operating profit margin, their costs were going to decrease. So obviously that was going to increase the operating profit margin. So if you have the numbers, calculate them. Cash flow, part of your calculation, you'd be able to calculate that. And so there was going to be approximately 466,000 per year. Talk about the impact to the maximum amount of investment. There's no significant upfront capital cost here. This is a great example of integration. So the best practice, I've already gone through this. QQC, your quantitative analysis, you only need maximum 2 to 3 sentences to summarize the result and then tell them to see that exhibit. Assumptions, state what the important assumptions are and state what the impact would be based on the case facts. Make sure that you always talk about the impact to the objectives and if there's constraint. Qualitative, we know that we want to use those subtitles. We know that you need to include the so what. When it comes to your recommendation, make sure that you're providing supported recommendation. And what that is you're highlighting both the quantitative and the strongest qualitative reasons why. Don't say based on my quantitative and qualitative analysis, I recommend. No, not all qualitative factors are equal. What are the strongest reasons of why you're recommending or not recommending that option? When it comes to your overall recommendations, you need to provide a recommendation for each of the options, and then you need to provide an overall recommendation. So you got to prioritize it, acknowledge those interrelationships. So this all relates back to structure. If you have the proper structure in place, it increases your chances of achieving a why when it comes to that requirement. So again, when it comes to your overall recommendations, conclude on each of the issues. Make sure it's consistent with your analysis, and then you need to take a step back and provide an overall recommendation. Even though they're all viable from a quantitative and qualitative, you need to prioritize those options. When it comes to communication, make sure that your writing is understandable, it's clear. Your quantitative analysis is not complicated, it's easy to follow. There's minimum spelling and grammatical errors, and the language used is professional. So in order to pass, you need to achieve yes on your situational analysis. You need to achieve yes for 2 of the strategic options, yes on your concluding advice, yes on your communication, and partial on the remaining assessment opportunities. What that means is you need to complete every assessment opportunity. You miss one, you achieve a no on an opportunity, that unfortunately results in a fail. So you need to manage your time well. So let's close with some best practices. Make sure that situational analysis does not need to be large. Extract some of the key information. Don't spend too much time in your quants and make them complicated. Make sure that you're addressing them, requires that you're ordering them so that in the proper order, so you're not spending a disproportionate amount of time on your operational issues. Don't forget the why and the impact. Make sure you're focusing when it comes to integration on those SWOT factors, the things that are relevant. Make sure your calculations are clear. And if there are any of the strategic options that are going to help with some of your operational deficiencies, it's important to highlight that. When the marker takes a moment and kind of reflects, these are the questions that they asked. Did the candidate step back and see the big picture and then address the broader issues? So if there was a significant issue, did you acknowledge it? Did you discuss it? Did you consider it in your analysis of your strategic and operational issues? Did they prioritize them? Did you use the quantitative and qualitative information? Did you use the right quantitative tools? Was there evidence of sufficient integration from your situational analysis? Did you communicate your ideas clearly? And did you add value? Your conclusions were credible. So again, I like to emphasize, and I hope that you're finding value in these webinars. The stress management and understanding the CFE, those recordings are available. The recording for this presentation will be available shortly. Day 2 and the path to competence. So I'm going to create a partial outline for day 2. That's going to occur on Monday, April the 14th. Day 3, I'm going to create a full outline for that, a day 3 case, and time management. And in the time management one, I'm also going to talk about the different quantitative tools. That is on Wednesday, April the 16th. The recordings and registration for these webinars can be found in D2L on the home page for Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE, or if you're rolled in, they're also available on the Capstone 2 website. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you have.
All right, no, thanks there, Debbie, for the great presentation. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but just to let everybody know, if we're not able to get to your question, we do apologize for that, as we only have a certain amount of time that's available for questions in the Q&A portion here of the event. So as Debbie mentioned, we will upload a recording to this presentation within the next day or so. So we'll just say the next couple of days, and we'll update the newsfeed posts within those two modules. As Debbie mentioned previously, just a reminder, you only get access to the presentation. So any of the Word documents that Debbie did reference here, those will not be available, but you'll be able to access the presentation. So just to let you guys know there. So now we'll just go ahead with the Q&A portion, as there's some questions that have come in there, Debbie. So I will go through my first question here. So first question is going to talk more going back to the strategic analysis framework. So I believe this came about where the candidate was under the impression that the SWOT analysis, which was part of the situational analysis, should be kept very simple and high level, since we're supposed to integrate those points more thoroughly when we get into the qualitative analysis later on. Can you provide your your thoughts on that comment there?
Sure. Now, what I've done is when I created that SWOT analysis is I extracted all of the relevant case facts that are clearly outlined. When you're going through it, you might not identify all of those opportunities. The important thing is if you just have a few strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, as long as they are the most appropriate considerations when you're looking at the strategic options, that should ensure that you meet the integration requirements. However, I want to caution you, I've seen many a situational analysis where the SWOT simply just stated the case fact. That's not enough. So if you're going to state the case fact, yes, if you can do it in a very clear and concise manner, but make sure that you go back and include the why and the impact. So I probably have, not probably, I know I have identified more factors than you could or need to, but I wanted to show you that there's lots of information available.
All right, perfect. No, thanks there, Debbie. In terms of providing your thoughts here, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna skip over a couple of these questions because there's a question that came in which I thought was really important, focusing on conclusions. So the candidate wrote here, when writing conclusions and overall conclusions, and when you say conclusions, this also refers to recommendations there. Should the candidate keep writing the recommendations or conclusions after addressing each strategic option, or should everything be included in an overall recommendation at the end? So
Oh,
these want some thoughts in this format there.
yeah, I love this question. So again, I provided you with effective structure that addresses all the requirements, which is QQC, quantitative, qualitative, and recommendation. So I highly suggest that you use that format because when you look at the feedback guide, what happens is they're making sure that you provided a recommendation from each of the strategic options, and then a separate component that they're marking is that you provided an overall recommendation. So the best way to ensure that you're doing both of those requirements is that you use a QQC format for your requireds, for the strategic options, and then you use a separate section for the overall recommendations. Now, I want to tell you, you can't simply just say, I recommend in the order of priority and just list those. You still need to restate, not to the same degree as the recommendations you have under each of the strategic options, but you need to restate why you're recommending it and why you're recommending it in that order. So if they want to prioritize that has the strongest impact to cash, that is one of the important reasons why you're recommending that's done first. So again, you're assessed on those separately. Do not merge them together.
All right. No, thanks there, Debbie. Yeah, it's one where conclusions and recommendations are done towards usually the last hour, the last half hour there. So I know for candidates, you guys could get to really, your energy is a little bit lower at that point. So it's good to remember this when you get to that particular point there. And sticking to the theme of conclusions and recommendations, I thought this was a very important question that I wanted to point out here, Debbie. So in an instance where, let's just say, a candidate decides to select a strategic option that's not in full alignment with the organization's mission or vision, what should the candidate consider in this situation? Should they just suggest to, oh, the board should revise their mission and vision, or what should the candidate consider when
Sure.
assessing the strategic option here?
Okay, love this question. So again, it's the wording of the vision, mission, and values. If you find that it's not aligned with some of the wording, that does not mean it's misaligned. It means if that option is implemented, maybe they need to change some of the wording. It's not misaligned. Misaligned means that it's fundamentally against, when I think about from a mission and from a vision perspective, it's fundamentally against who the company is. Part of your overall recommendations is you don't need to, unlike the Capstone 1 case, you do not need to talk about revising the mission and vision statement. So I find candidates sometimes think about it's either aligned or misaligned, and ask yourself, if some of the wording needs to change a little bit, that's not misaligned because it isn't breaking the fundamental concept of who they are as an organization.
Yeah, no, that's great there, Debbie. And I just always like to add on here, remember, take a step back, like give
Mhm.
yourself like some time, like right at the end. I know it's the hardest thing to do, but take that time there, like look at all your strategic options or whatever recommendations are, make sure things alignment there, because one of the things where we found is that candidates may have done everything correctly except for once you get to the conclusion section. So you want to make sure you give a proper conclusion and recommendation and consider everything, like does it make sense at the end of the day there. So I just wanted to put that out there. No, thanks there, Debbie.
Perfect.
So one thing here, this is, I think some candidates are thinking about this, bring it more in line with the strategic analysis framework. So the question is, if there is a new objective that's presented within the case, are the old objectives completely overwritten or are they just added to the list of objectives? I know a lot of candidates might be thinking about that, but wanted to ask your opinion there.
Sure. You're always guided by the information in the day one case. So maybe some of those objectives are the same, maybe they aren't. If in this instance, all of the objectives are different, except the operating profit margin, but I think the goal, I'm trying to remember now, I think it might be the same goal it was in the past. When it comes to the objectives, don't worry about what they were in the past. Worry about what they're giving you in the day one case. That's what you need to include under your quantitative analysis.
All right, perfect. No, so thanks for that there, Debbie. Just to try to make it a little bit more clear in regards to what's needed for day one there. So this question's come about. I know Debbie, you addressed this here in the SWOT. So some candidates are thinking, okay, is there a certain number that they need in their SWOT analysis? Like, oh, do we need to list like three strengths, three opportunities, three threats, and so forth, etc.? Is it a minimum number, or is this something that can vary in terms of the level of depth that's required there?
Yes, nobody knows what the amount of if anyone says that they know, oh, you need so many factors, the only people who know are the people who've created the exam. What we do know is the situational analysis in isolation doesn't count for anything. It's how you integrate, how you include that information in your quantitative and qualitative analysis. So be guided by what are the most relevant case facts that you can use as part of your quantitative and qualitative analysis of those options. That's the right number. As long as you're able to meet the integration requirements and you're focusing on the primary considerations, so SWOT, key success factors, then you should be able to clearly demonstrate that you understand the internal and external environment in which the company operates and what their goals are and how implementing those options are going to, how are they going to capitalize on those opportunities and strengths? How are they going to mitigate those threats and weaknesses? Make sure that you have enough to perform a proper analysis. That's the number you need.
All right, perfect. No, thanks there, Debbie. And yeah, unfortunately, we are at time in terms of the Q&A portion of tonight's webinar. We apologize for not being able to answer those questions that have come in regards to that there. But no, on behalf of the CP Western School of Business, CP Ontario, and as well as CP Atlantic, we'd like to thank you, Debbie, for tonight's webinar presentation there. And we'd like to thank all of you for attending tonight's webinar. So just as a reminder, we'll be posting a link to the recording within the next couple of days or so here. So on behalf of everyone, we want to wish everybody a good night and best of luck on day one of the CFE.
Sounds good practice, everyone, and I hope to see you. And again, look at the recording. There's some great information about structure that helps increase your chances of meeting the requirements and passing day one. Good luck.